I'm here with Dr Mari Takayanagi to talk about the Speakers' Conference of October 1916 to January 1917, which actually took place in this very spot. What led to the calling of the Speakers' Conference?
So the Speakers' Conference on Electoral Reform was called because there hadn't been an election since a general election in this country since 1910, and by the middle of the war this government had seriously outrun its time, and they kept passing laws to say we can extend its wartime, we can extend the parliament, but eventually they were going to have to call a new election. And they also realised that they couldn't call a new election on the old electoral register that was in place before the war, because 40% of men couldn't vote before 1914, which I think sometimes people forget. And all the soldiers and sailors, the men in the armed services that were abroad, would have all failed the residence requirements, so none of them would have been able to vote, and this was not politically acceptable. So some kind of mechanism was needed to decide electoral reform. Parliament discussed this several times over the years, the Cabinet discussed it, and nobody could agree. And eventually Walter Long, who was a Cabinet Minister, suggested that what was needed was a bigger body, a cross-party, cross-house conference that represented all the interests to look at not just the franchise but other aspects of electoral reform as well, boundary reform, things that would need to be sorted out before the next election.
And who were the key people that were there at the conference?
So the conference was it was a big body, 32 MPs and members of the House of Lords, and the most important person was the Speaker himself, who presided over it, Speaker Lothar. He was a very respectable man. He had a background of antagonism to women's suffrage because he'd been Speaker before the First World War, when suffragettes were busy barracking the place and chaining themselves to statues and hiding in cupboards, and he was a person that had had to deal with that. So as a result, he wasn't seen as very sympathetic to women's suffrage. But he was also a very sort of even-handed kind of person. He was very, as Speaker, he was politically impartial, and he was known to be a sort of a fair man who would look at the issues properly. And when he was asked to chair the Speakers' Conference, he was very reluctant to do so because he could see what an enormous challenge it was, but he accepted it as a part of his duty in wartime, that a way had to be found forward on electoral reform, and it was his job to do so.
What did the conference actually recommend? So
the conference made recommendations on various aspects of electoral reform, including boundary reform, the method and cost of elections. It's because of this that we have general elections on one day and not spread over several days, for example. And they looked at how people registered to vote as well. But the most important recommendations were on the franchise for both men and for women. Basically it recommended that all men should have the vote. Which is not too surprising given why it had been set up, and that some women should have the vote. And this was the subject of much discussion at the Speakers' Conference. The records of proceedings are very sketchy, but the key figures here were suffrage sympathisers John Simon and, most importantly, Willoughby Dickinson MP, who was a stalwart defender of rights of women, a supporter of women's suffrage throughout the militant suffragette days, and he was the one that suggested the essential compromise, which is that if it wasn't acceptable to give women the vote on the same terms as men, then you should have an age limit, and if that was still enfranchised too many women, as the argument went, by putting in the property qualification for the local government franchise, that would reduce the numbers to an acceptable level. And it does appear to have been this that won the day and meant that the conference supported by a majority that some measure of franchise should be conferred on women who had reached an age they couldn't quite agree on, but 30 or 35 won most favour.
And why then did the government actually agree to implement the legislation based on these recommendations? Because at this point they were just recommendations.
Yes, the whole Speakers' Conference report was all recommendations, but they were accepted pretty much wholesale by the government. The mechanism for this was a vote of thanks. So there was a vote of thanks in the House of Commons, which was put in by Asquith. And although Asquith had been Prime Minister at the start of the conference, he wasn't Prime Minister anymore. He was now Leader of the Opposition. And so this was seen as a cross-party support for the conference recommendations. And apart from a few very die-hard voices in the House, everybody thought that the Speaker should be thanked and the conference recommendations should be implemented. And I should say it was also because women outside Parliament were pressing very hard for the recommendations legislation on women's suffrage to be incorporated into the bill. Millicent Fawcett was there throughout the conference, writing to Asquith before it was even set up. Various women's suffrage organisations were lobbying individual members of the Speakers' Conference, even picketing the House of Commons outside to make their case heard. And so when push came to shove, it went into the bill, the Representation of the People bill, but the House of Commons was given a free vote on it.